We're all familiar with the philanthropy of Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, but little is known about Asian philanthropists and how they operate in the region. Well, a new benchmark study by INSEAD and UBS aims to shed light, and joining us today to discuss the findings are INSEAD Adjunct Professor of Entrepreneurship, Mahboob Mahmood, and Singaporean philanthropist Lawrence Lien. Thank you both for joining us today on INSEAD Knowledge. Mahboob, as one of the authors of this report, is there an Asian model of philanthropy that's distinct from the West?
I wouldn't say there's a specific model, but there are some features that we see that are fairly common across Asia. Of course, the first element is that families play a very, very large role in business, and families are large and complex, and so the philanthropies also tend to reflect that complexity. Secondly, there's a very, very strong linkage between family giving and community, by which I mean families largely give either within their countries or more specifically within their communities, because there are different ethnic communities living in the diaspora. That may also mean giving into other countries, but within the community. There's very little giving in Asia that goes outside of Asia. Second interesting finding was that the role of education is looms very large in family giving in Asia. Around 36% or so of all family giving, more than 3 times the next level of sector that contributions are made, go to education. Third element is religion. It's surprisingly small. Under 5% of giving goes to religious institutions or causes. That doesn't mean that religion is not an important inspiring force for giving, but that the money isn't necessarily going into religious institutions. And another very important characteristic is that Asian philanthropy tends to have a very strong operational bias. In other words, the foundations tend to set up their own initiatives to which they make contributions to a much larger extent than, for example, in the United States or the West. Let's take the Bill Gates Foundation. The Bill Gates Foundation works quite considerably, to considerable extent, with institutions, NGOs and others around the world, whereas, for example, the Lien Foundation in Singapore, Lawrence's family foundation, does some of that kind of work, but then has also set up a number of its own institutions to drive its philanthropic initiatives.
Lawrence, you are the chairman of the Lien Foundation, which is your family's philanthropic organization. One of the highlights that came up from the study is the divide between generations in the focus and style of giving. Is that something that you find to be true in your case, and can you give us some examples?
I think certainly it's true in our case. The old style was much more traditional, as Mahboob pointed out. My grandfather, who set up the foundation, was only sponsoring education courses. It's practically 100% in education courses. So one of the things, when I started working on the board of the foundation was to open up to other areas. So we added elder care, we added the environment. We felt that education was fairly limiting, especially in Singapore, where the government actually sponsors a lot of educational initiatives. The other area where there were differences, and there have been, is the style of philanthropy. Previously, it's much more armchair giving, passive. You just give a grant, it's just a check. And you don't ask any questions after that. Our style of philanthropy is much more strategic now, in the sense that we want to make a new impact, we want to make a new difference. We are always looking for areas which are underserved, or where there are gaps, or where a new way of doing things will help. So our new tagline is radical philanthropy.
Mahmood, what do you think is holding back the large-scale development of this sector?
I think one is there is a real need to shift from what I call incremental giving to transformational giving. In other words, you can either try to solve existing problems through existing channels, or you can look at problems in a new way and try to come up with transformational strategies. And by and large, philanthropies in Asia are doing the former, not the latter. The most important shift that needs to take place is not got to do with organization, it's got to do with imagination.
How would you rate the effectiveness of high-profile organizations like the Clinton Foundations and the Gates Foundations? And can their models and best practices work in Asia?
I think Asia has to evolve its own model of philanthropy. The US, the non-profit sector, the civil society is a lot more developed. There are a lot more organizations serving the sector and serving social needs very well. In Asia, in a lot of countries, civil society organizations are immature. The civil society has not been allowed to develop because of strong government or a dominant government and so on. So we need to invest in building new organizations, and that's why we started INSEAD, for example, to do water and sanitation projects. We didn't just sponsor third-party organizations. And I think you still see a lot more of that in Asia as the civil society matures.
Yeah, and I would add to that by saying that it's the NGOs and civil society organizations that have developed in Asia often have gotten funding either from government sources or multilateral sources or from foreign foundations such as the Bill Gates Foundation and the like. So that has allowed them to professionalize to an extent and to scale, but it's also made them somehow less relevant to family foundations in Asia. So what you have is a series of institutions that are not necessarily being substantially funded by family foundations because they're getting larger scale money from other places, but they're also losing the benefit of the enterprising drive that these families have of creating value in their own countries or in the region. So the challenge is to create an implementing institutional structure that is scalable and is able to attract funds not only from the particular family that started it, but from other sources as well.
What kind of checklist would you offer to wealthy individuals that are ready to give and operate in this region?
Being able to strategize is one very important factor, and then the other aspect is to be able to implement that strategy in a sustainable, large-scale manner.
Just to emphasize, I think focus is very important. Problems are so complex. If you don't focus, you cannot get deep in terms of helping to solve that problem. And that focus must also resonate with your personal interest and the family's interest. To add on to the strategy point, I think you need to professionalize to implement strategies. You need to understand your theory of change, at which level you are working at, whether it's advocacy, which is trying to push for policy change, or you are building capacity in the sector, or you are doing service delivery. You have to understand your theory of change and stick to it. The thing about philanthropy and foundation is that you can take a very long-term view. You can take risk. You have entrepreneurial skills. Use these because these are the assets and the strengths of private business people who have made a lot of money. These are not the assets of governments typically. So use these assets to help solve problems.
Lawrence and Mahbub, thank you so much for joining us today on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.